In mid-1853, in a Boston newspaper called the Illustrated Waverley Magazine, a dispute arose between various people writing to the editor under different pseudonyms. The topic under discussion was whether, in writing The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe had borrowed heavily from an earlier poem by Thomas H. Chivers called To Allegra Florence in Heaven, a tribute to his 3-year-old daughter who had died in October of 1842. Indeed, there are some striking similarities. The debate is opened by someone citing Fiat Justitia, whom some scholars assume to have been Chivers, speaking of himself in third person. I don't think this assumption is correct, but in any case, there are some 6 different letter writers who join the fray from July 30 until the editor calls a halt to it on October 29. Not surprisingly, there are pros and cons, including a somewhat similar poem by Chivers called Isidore, which some scholars suggest was written in 1841. Mathew Franklin Whittier would have written The Raven shortly after the experience which the poem describes, sometime in December of that year. What concerns us here is that one of these debaters is, in fact, Mathew himself, signing with his long-time secret signature, a printer's asterisk or star. With tongue firmly in cheek, he uses his typical literary code to tell us the following. 1. That Poe wrote in whatever style he pleased, that he wrote in a great many different styles, and that he was an imitator. 2. That the letter writers should strive to be original, inferring that they are not. And 3. That he, the star, is exceptionally original. If you put these together, given that the subject under discussion is the poem The Raven, the message is clear. Poe, being an imitator, did not write The Raven. Likewise for the letter writers. But he, the star, is exceptionally and extremely original. Therefore, logically, he must have been the original author of the poem. Thomas H. Chivers and Mathew Franklin Whittier were, in the early 1840s, both members of the Swedenborgian Church. Since they would have disagreed about slavery, this was probably their only commonality, aside from both being poets. Thus, if there was any influence, one way or the other, it probably came through their involvement in that church. There seems to be some controversy about when Chivers wrote Isidore, with certain scholars asserting that it was written in 1841. I think that's unlikely, because the comparison is too on target, but it is not of equal quality with The Raven. Logically, the superior is unlikely to have been inspired by the inferior. Furthermore, the general consensus seems to be that Chivers was a prolific poet of erratic and inconsistent quality, which suggests to me that he was an imitator. In any case, when Chivers wrote To Allegra Florence in Heaven, after his 3-year-old daughter died in October of 1842, he would certainly have been influenced by The Raven if Mathew had shared it with him, say, at a Swedenborgian convention, just as he had presumably shared it privately with Edgar Allan Poe. I will now read the letter from the Star, as it appears in the August 27, 1853 edition of the Illustrated Waverley Magazine. Edgar A. Poe. Dearie, dearie, says a Waverley Partington, what is the world coming to? Poe has actually written in the same style of Chivers, it is said. I don't care if he wrote in a dozen styles. Now, likely as not, he was one of those that wrote what he chose, and when he chose, and the way he chose. A real mockingbird, wasn't he? Well, P always loved the mockingbirds, because they don't everlastingly make the same sounds. But all birds haven't that gift, you know. Girls, now I think of it, it will never do for you to make your bread as your grandmothers did. If you do, though the flour and the milk and the yeast is your own, and you knead it and bake it yourselves, your grandmothers will have the praise. You little echoes, as sure as Fiat Justitia dines with you, I guess the roses will mount your cheeks when he tells you in severe tones that he has tasted a crumb from an old loaf, that there is no mistaking this matter, that one loaf was taken from the other just as sure as the first was ever baked. Girls, girls, I say make your own receipts, or you will never prove that you have originality. True, you may gain notoriety as housewives, but you will never be natural cooks like your grandmothers. When I write, I shall startle the world by writing without rule, measure, or style, and for keeping house, I've a snug little plan of my own. My chairs will be on their sides, the tables and timepiece bottom upwards, my drawer handles inside, my kittens in cages, and my canaries at liberty. In short, you don't catch me dying into an echo, as poor Poe would if he had lived long enough to. Depend upon it, I will prove that I have some original ideas and some little ways of my own, or, you see, I should never be considered a genuine Partington. In this letter, Partington is a reference to Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber's character, Mrs. Partington, who typically got everything wrong. Mathew had very recently been heavily involved in Shillaber's comic magazine, The Carpetbag, and had even written one of the Partington sketches over his star signature. He evidently means, by calling the letter writers Waverley Partingtons, that they had got it all wrong. Where Mathew says, P always loved the mockingbirds because they don't everlastingly make the same sounds, this isn't a reference, as it obviously seems to be, to Edgar Allan Poe. It's a reference to his wife Abby, whose maiden name was Poyen. It's his way of bringing Abby into the discussion because he had written The Raven in tribute to her. Abby was an exceptional poet. What Mathew means here is that Abby had that talent, but Poe did not. This is an example of code which only posterity will ever decipher. In the closing, he tells us that he is embedding code in his works, which, as I have demonstrated in this video series, will reveal his real literary legacy to posterity. This is what he means when he says, I will prove that I have some original ideas and some little ways of my own. That he is a, quote, genuine Partington may mean that he has, in fact, been directly involved in that series as a collaborator with Shillaber, and that he has been writing in that genre for almost 30 years at the time this letter was published. It's simply one more way for him to sign the letter.